Aninzigo, Kajimigwich, Gaje Manitou, Makwa, Musayat, and Indishnakas, Anishinabekwe, Kisukus First Nation, and Donji, Makwa Dodam. Good morning, everyone. What I've said to you in my Soto language is greeted you for the day, told you my traditional name and that I give thanks to the Creator for that. In my community, in my nation, it's my uncle's responsibility to give me a traditional name. And so the one they chose, Makwa Musayat, the closest translation in English means I'm walking with bears. I want to acknowledge the people from Musqueam and that we're meeting on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam people. And I want to acknowledge that they have made space here for us. And for most of the institutions in British Columbia, people have been moved, the traditional people have been moved from that site to make space. And so I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge any elders in the room. And to my colleagues, I want to thank Karen for inviting me to be here today. Shauna Williams, who's just been amazing to work with and has made things so seamless. And I have not met her yet, but there's a lady named Jamie Envoy who has just been grace personified. I want to start also by acknowledging the work of Vancouver City Council to recognize that this modern city of Vancouver is located on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples. And I really appreciate that in 2014 they acknowledged on their website and in a council meeting that these lands were never ceded through treaty, war, or surrender. So that basically means that everybody that's living in Vancouver is squatting on land. And a big part of my presentation is going to be talking about reconciliation and the inequities that exist for post-secondary and for all of us, and ways that we might move forward together. I have a message from my daughter. And she joined me the other night when I got here to Vancouver. She's my youngest child. I have 6 children, and my youngest child is a nurse at the Victoria General Hospital. And she said, "So what are you doing in town, Mom?" And I told her I was coming to talk to you, and this look came across her face. Is anybody here a parent of like a 26-year-old daughter? So this look came across her face, and I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, you know, Mom, when you talk to people about Indigenous issues, you get a little forceful." My daughter, she worries about my feelings, right? So she said to me, "You know, you might want to start your talk off by just looking at everybody in the audience and saying, 'I really like you a lot.'" And so you'll forgive me. This is a passion of mine, and this is not just something theoretical. This is my family that I'm going to be talking about. These are people that I know and love, and things that have happened to them in Canada that have harmed them. And so I'm going to have you keep Kirsten's caution to me in mind. If there are Indigenous people in the room today, I want to speak directly to them, because what you're going to see in the presentation, like I said, isn't theoretical for us. And this could trigger people. Sometimes it happens. It sneaks up on us because of intergenerational trauma and because of the things that have happened to people in our lives. And so I just want to say I'm going to be around afterwards, and if you are triggered by what you see, I hope that you'll come and talk to me. This group of people, this wonderful group of people, there were pre-conference workshops yesterday, and this group of people decided that they would come and learn about indigenizing and decolonizing curriculum. And I said at the beginning, you know, I really like to take a picture, because lots of times when I go into meetings around Indigenization, it's all Indigenous people in the room. And sometimes it's a little frustrating and sometimes it's saddening, and we wonder where everybody else is. And so I said, can I take a picture of you guys, because I want to be able to show my colleagues. Out of all the workshops that people could choose yesterday, they chose to come to learn about indigenizing their curriculum. And these are my allies in the making. And I'm sure some of them are in here today. Like I said, this is about family. The lady in the hat, the white hat, that's my grandma. When she was growing up, she attended Lebret Residential School in the Fort Capel Valley in Saskatchewan. The man sitting next to her in the plaid shirt, that's my father, Orville. He's also a residential school survivor. This picture was taken a little while ago because he's 85 now. The man below, standing with me about 5 years ago, is my adoptive father. He adopted me into the Cree Nation at Onion Lake, Saskatchewan. And the man below is my brother Robbie. He was older than me, and he had to attend residential school. I did not. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about some things that I know to be true based in my experience as an Indigenous person in this country. And I recognize that it may be different than your experience. And I'm going to ask you just to come with me on that discussion. The quote at the bottom, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows and the river flows, that's what is inherent in our treaty. I come from Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, and Kisakus is on the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border, about 20 miles into the Saskatchewan area, west of the border. And that is my nation, Kisakus. Oh yeah, there's two laptops here. Anybody know Buffy St. Marie? Have you ever heard of her? Yeah? Okay. She's also from Saskatchewan. She's from Piapat First Nation, which is not far from my community. And now she's 78 years old. She was someone that was removed from her community as an infant, as a small child, and sent to live in Massachusetts with some adoptive parents. She's part of the 60 Scoop. She also happens to be the only First Nations person from Canada that has an Academy Award. I'm not usually talking to people at 8:30 in the morning, and I needed some help to wake up. So I found something from Buffy, and this is a song that she sings called Star Walker, which is a very sacred being in our life. I'd like to play it for you, just to get us in the mood and to set the tone. And if you feel like getting up and dancing, you can come join me.
He's a
Thank you, Moses. A big part of getting to know people in the Indigenous community is joining in and doing things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise do. So I really want to thank the people that stood up and showed their dance moves, and there was a lady up there that was just going it, and I just recognize that. Thank you very much. A big part of getting to know people and doing work with people in our community is being present and being seen in community. When Mary Jo and her husband Wayne were here, I said, I remember that lady, but I can't quite remember her name, and she came over and reminded me. Our communities are so small, important for us to make those connections and to maintain them and to be gracious when people reach out and invite you to join. So thanks this morning, and I hope nobody's writing a test next door. Talking about our Indigenous knowledge and embedding that into Western education systems. I think it's really important that we have an upfront discussion about that. For me, it's very complex, it's emotional, and it's very difficult work sometimes. And I have to prepare myself to stand in front of people and stand in front of classrooms and talk about some of the worst things that have come into our lives. And to be able to communicate it to people in a way that doesn't leave them feeling burdened or resentful or angry or confused or scared. All of those things hold us all back from moving forward. So I've been in classrooms where people are saying, I'm really uncomfortable with this, and I think discomfort is a good thing. I think if we're all comfortable with indigenization, it means we're not doing a very good job. I think that sense of disrupting the status quo is really important, and that's key and critical in the work that I do. And as I was telling people yesterday, I can't believe that people actually pay me to do this work, to have a voice, to say things that lots of us are thinking that maybe people aren't hearing in the way that we want them to hear. It creates a lot of tension, though, as well, and it can create tension for people that are coming as newcomers to this country, because what they tend to learn about Indigenous people are all the stereotypes first, and maybe something that someone told their auntie about something that they saw. And the other place that people get a lot of information is from the news media. And I invite you any day in Canada to read a news article about anything to do with Indigenous people, and then to look at the comment section. That's something that I don't do anymore because it just infuriates me so much. But if we think that we live in a very progressive and culturally sensitive community, or nation, I just invite you to look at the comments to see the racism that is so prevalent in this country regarding anything Indigenous, including Indigenous people. This young man, his name is MD, and he was a student in a course that I taught last year. All of the students at TRU in the Master of Education program had their capstone presentations. His was on English language challenges for Asian international students at BC universities, and that happened the night that I was driving down. I'm going to be talking about him a little bit more because he said, "Oh, Auntie, you're going to get in front of all these English as an additional language teachers, and I have a lot to say to them," he told me. And so I'm going to share some of his words as we go forward. I was talking to you about this country that we live in that I know maybe in a different way than you know. And I'm going to talk about this lady, Annie. She lives in a little community called the Gloolik in Nunavut. And I visited her community as part of the Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference in 2008. And Annie is 110 years old. And her son was 86. And they were the elders that we were waiting for. They'd been out hunting for our dinner. And we were supposed to have dinner at 6 o'clock in Igloolik, and they showed up at about 8:30. And with this meat that was put out on cardboard on the floor, and we were all given ulus to cut off pieces of that meat. During the dinner, I sat next to Annie, and she said, you know, what is it that you do, Shelly? And so I told her, and she said, you know, I have a story, and when you're talking to Canadians, I hope that you share my story. And so I said, sure, I would do that. Annie told me that when she was a young woman, she was married to a man from the Eastern Arctic, and she lived in the Western Arctic. And what that meant at that time was that she had to leave her community and go join his community. And she said that when she got to her new community, her husband received like a medallion like what I'm wearing, but it had letters and numbers on it. And it was basically his social insurance number that was given to him by the federal government. And I said, oh, well, what did you get, Annie? And so what she did was she was wearing a pair of leggings like this. And so she lifted up her tunic and she pulled down her leggings so that I could see her right hip. And on her hip, were letters and numbers tattooed. And I said, Annie, where did those come from? And she said, it was the government people that put it there. It was in 1944 when a lot of our Indigenous men were overseas fighting against Germany and their allies. And that happened in this country. And I've gone lots of times looking through archives for information to be able to support that. And you know, Canada didn't make that available. And so that's in our elders' memory, in our encyclopedias, in our internet, which was our elders. How many people in this room knew that Canada did that? One person that I can see, two people. Yeah. It's not a part of the curriculum that Canada wants us to be teaching, but it's an important part for all of us to be aware of. My nation is a treaty nation. It means we have a treaty at the time that it was signed in 1874, a treaty with the Queen and with the Crown. It's now been transferred to Canada. This province that we live in does much of British Columbia is not covered by treaty. But when I started to think about, you know, what decolonizing and indigenizing education really means to me, it starts with truth-telling and telling the real stories about what's happened in our lives and in our families and in our communities. And addressing that really is addressing these historic and contemporary wrongs that are continuing, that we're all part of, that we're all connected to in one way, shape, or form. And there's a need for redress in this country for many of these things. This picture that I have up by Kent Monkman is called The Scream. And this is a painting that's well known to Indigenous people and just represents the removal of our children against our wishes and against what we asked for in treaty. We asked for education for our children. We didn't ask for the churches and the state to implement a systemic pattern of abuse and violence connected to education in this country. And that's what's happened. And we are living now, in my generation, my children's generation, with the intergenerational trauma of what was inflicted by the church and the state and the police in this country. And I'm sorry to say that today is April 12th, 2019. The Catholic Church that ran more than 50% of the residential schools in this country has yet to apologize to Indigenous people. That's a reality in this country today. Where I come from, this is the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and the children in the black and white picture were students there. Like the elder Mary Jane Joe was talking about, this is where she went to school. Widespread patterns of abuse, violence, medical experimentation, starvation, sexual abuse, no supports, even at a time when people were aware that there was a segregated system of education. Many people say that they weren't aware that it was basically a weapon. Education was used as a weapon against us. And so for many people that attended, or children or grandchildren that grew up listening to these stories about their parents and grandparents at school, that intergenerational trauma, that blood memory that we believe exists, is here for most of us. And that has some pretty specific implications for post-secondary education. These students in this picture with me are part of an Indigenous Research Methodologies course that I taught last year, and part of it was taking them to the residential school, grounding them in the Kikwili, in the pit houses, in the land, so that they understood what happened to the people there and why things are the way they are in our communities. And these are students from all over the world. How many people knew that children in our schools, in the Canadian Indian residential schools, were subjects of nutritional experiments and starvation? How many people? Maybe about 20%. Okay. This is true. And this is Ian Mosby. He was a historian that was working on his PhD when he uncovered this nutritional and human biomedical experimentation, but there was much more. My dad attended Fort Qu'Appelle Lebret Residential School. He recalls being 6 years old and the dental students from the University of Regina coming to their school, somewhere with the mistaken belief that Indigenous people couldn't feel pain. And so he had an abscessed tooth, and they did not use any numbing agent, anything for him as a little boy. My dad's 85, he's never been back to a dentist in his life. The widespread sexual abuse, I have aunts that attended the schools as well. They have no trust in the medical system. And one of my aunts died of uterine cancer because she basically would never go to see a doctor because of the way that she was sexually assaulted and exploited at the residential school that she attended. So lots of long-term implications. It's not just what happened to the people, but for us that are left behind, that are living through this experience. If you've done any reading whatsoever about medicine or our experiences with medicine, that's great. If you've not, this is one book that I highly recommend to you for your summer enjoyment reading. It's called Medicine Unbundled. It's by a BC writer. His name's Gary Geddes, and actually he spoke with a lot of the elders that live here in Vancouver and on the island about their experiences in healthcare. If you don't know this history, you're not going to be able to teach it to the students that are coming from around the world, and they're going to be left with stereotypes. They're going to be left with half-truths. So I'm really hopeful that you'll take up the invitation to do some reading on your own. He talks about biological warfare that was enacted against people in this province and the deliberate spread of smallpox. He talks about people receiving cowpox vaccines, our people, which means that you're not going to be susceptible to the disease, but the people that you come in contact with are going to die. And how that was deliberately used against Indigenous people in this province to make way for settlers coming for the gold rush, lots of influx of people. How many people in this room know that Canada had a two-tiered system for Indigenous health through Indian hospitals? Anybody ever hear of an Indian hospital? Again, about 20%. If you've not, I really encourage you to do some of this reading here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's an important piece for you to be aware of. So there were 3 Indian hospitals in BC. There were about 122 across the country. And they were in place from the 30s until the 70s. And they really started because of TB that was rampant in a lot of the Indian residential schools in Canada. The TB Association was concerned about the spread of TB to non-Indigenous populations. what makes that really difficult for me is knowing that those people had no concerns about putting children's cots really close to one another in the residential school. One cot may hold a child that has active TB. One cot beside them was a child that did not have active TB. When those children, many died in the hospitals, but some were sent home to their community very sick, also infecting the people that they were living with, their families. The Indian hospitals practiced the same kind of thing. So in Fort Qu'Appelle, that was the first one in the country. That's the territory that I come from. It's a hospital that my dad and a couple of his brothers were at for short periods of time. And that was the same thing. If you had a broken leg, you would come to the Indian hospital. Many times those hospitals would be in the basement of a typical Canadian hospital. And what else is in the basement of a typical Canadian hospital? Morgues. Our people have very specific protocols around who can be around dead bodies, who can cleanse them. Lots of ceremony around that, getting people ready for their journey on. So if I had a broken leg, maybe I just don't want to be around somebody's spirit that's still wandering and is not ready to move on yet. So I might not go. But if I'm a child and I'm sent there from a residential school with active TB, I might be put in a cot right next to somebody with a broken leg, because it was general for everyone. And the feds found out that they could pay people less to work in Indian hospitals. And so the standard of care and the overcrowding were also issues. I have an uncle named Norman, who's 82 now. And when he was a little guy, he would have probably been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because even as an 80-year-old now, he's really speedy and it's hard to keep up with him. And when he went, he was there for an issue with his knee. That didn't stop him from getting up and visiting absolutely everybody, and probably annoying the heck out of everyone that was there. And the way that they dealt with him was through a process called castitis. Has anybody heard of castitis? One person in this room. This was a very common practice when there's underfunding, overcrowding, issues like this. And so what they did was they put him in a cast, and it started about here, and it went to here, and they put a metal bar between his legs. And they put him in bed, and that's where he stayed for 3 months. That was their way of managing children, because that's the resources that they had. When you are incapacitated and vulnerable like that, that's something that never leaves you, and it's something that's never left him, and those stories have never left our family. And so what that means is that for a lot of us, there's lack of trust in the education system, lack of trust in the healthcare system, lack of trust in the judicial system. Lots of things. So just a definition here by James Anaya, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, around who are the Indigenous people. Moses, I'm hoping this works. Oh, look at that. This is my friend Cindy Blackstock. Her sister Sheila works at TRU in the nursing department. She and Pam Palmater, who is also a Canada Research Chair, they have a few things to say about Indigenization and reconciliation. I thought I'd share it with you guys today. Everybody still with me? Oh, okay. They say, when you've been talking in a classroom for 10 minutes, half the people have gone to sleep or checked out already. So I'd just like to check with you. So this is very short, just a couple minutes.
So what is reconciliation anyway? There's a number of things that are not reconciliation. Hiring more Indigenous peoples is not reconciliation. Having more artwork in offices is not reconciliation. We should already be doing these things.
Before how I can help comes as a question, I think they first need to understand.
All you need is access to Google, and you'll be able to get onto the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's website and read the report. And even if you don't want to read it, you can read it in YouTube videos. Have it read to you.
And then, not just know the truth, but there's the justice part, where you actually address and make amends for everything that's happened and is still happening.
The reality is that First Nations kids are still getting between 20 to 50% less funding across every public service.
So until there's no more murder to missing Indigenous women or our people over-incarcerated in prison, how can we skip forward to the fun reconciliation part of things?
There is no federal plan to eliminate those inequalities. And some people say, well, you know, there must be a reason for this. But let's take boil water advisories. The Government of Canada can get a DART team in the air, fly them to an earthquake zone halfway around the world and get clean water pumping in 24 hours. So why can't they do that for First Nations communities in Canada? We're making choices to allow the racial discrimination to continue. And that's what we need to stop.
We will never get to real truth, justice, and reconciliation until there is a substantial transfer of power, wealth, and resources. And that means lands have to come back. That also means there has to be us sharing in the resources. And it also means a recognition and full implementation of our sovereign right to be self-determining.
When you think about the greatest human rights abuses that were done in Canada, the Chinese head tax, the internment of Japanese Canadians, and residential school, they all have two things in common. First, they were all perpetrated by the Canadian government. And second, we all let it happen because we couldn't watch the injustice and speak up and do something about it. Reconciliation is our chance to learn how to not turn away.
If I help these people in professional positions or positions of power understand what it is Indigenous people have been going through and have gone through, it's going to help my children in school right now. It's going to help their children, and it's going to help, 7 generations.
That's why I never talk about reconciliation without talking about truth, justice, and reconciliation. You won't get that from hanging artwork in an office.
I want to talk to you a bit about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. How many people in the room have read any part of it? Again, some light reading for the rest of my colleagues this summer. And you don't have to read the whole thing, but it's meant to identify the minimum standards of service and supports and rights for Indigenous people in this country. And specifically, Articles 14, 15, 17, and 21 have to deal with education. And basically what the most important part, I think, is 14.1, and it says Indigenous people have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. That's a big ask, and that is also the minimum standard. Again, light reading for you for the summer. There's no way that you can teach people about issues relating to Indigenous people if you're not aware of these particular sections and that this document exists. So I encourage you to do that. Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. When the calls to action were published by the TRC in 2015, that was really the first time that Indigenization really came to the forefront in Canadian institutions in a pretty powerful way. And it was really informed by the testimony of thousands of survivors in Canada's Indian residential schools, because there was 150,000 over about a 120-year period. And the document called for some foundational change in the operation of both Canadian government institutions as well as in Canadian civil society. And universities at that time vowed to undertake a concerted program of reconciliation to correct the historical issues and injustices and misuse of education in Canadian colonial endeavors. The new system brought about by the TRC, and I'm just looking for my, oh, that's interesting. It really talked to us about how we need to make space, how administrators, how unions need to make space in post-secondary institutions for our Indigenous knowledges, our Indigenous people, our languages, and our ways of knowing, being, and doing that are fundamentally different from Canadian ways of doing. How many people have read the 94 Calls to Action? So about 10% of you. Again, this is some really light reading for you for the summertime, and I really encourage you, if you're going to be teaching things in a good way based on solid facts and foundation, and on the words of 150,000 people in this country and their descendants that experienced this, if you didn't have an opportunity to attend any of the hearings, that's really too bad, because that was life-changing for me. And I think for many other people that attended. Then you ask any Indigenous person in this country, where were you the day that Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood up in the House of Commons and apologized to all of the Indian residential school survivors and their families in this country? And I bet you 99% of the people will be able to tell you where they were, what they were doing. It's like I can remember where I was the day Elvis died, right? For people that attended residential school and their families, this was a big day. This was the day that Canada said what we did was wrong and we should have never done it, and we're sorry. That was the beginning, but it couldn't end there. That day, I was in a little airport in Nunavut, getting ready to fly back to Ottawa. And I was there with a study group of about 13 other people. And we knew that it was coming, and in my study group, I was the only Indigenous person and the only person with a father, brother, or grandparents or aunts and uncles that attended residential school. Because it was so important to me to not be alone to listen to that, all of my colleagues sat in a horseshoe around me, close enough to touch me, but there in support. And all I could think about that day was my dad watching? Was my brother watching? And were they okay? Shortly after that, my plane was ready to go, and so I got on and I was sitting in a seat beside a guy from Nunavut who was an Inuk person. And we didn't say anything for a while. And then he turned to me and he said, "What did you think about that?" And I said, "You know, the thing that I think about most is I really wish this had happened when my grandmother was still alive, because it meant so many things for her and her relationships with her children. And I have to hope that she was there with me." I said, "What did it mean to you?" And he said, excuse my language, but it's his language. He said, "I don't give a fuck what that prime minister had to say." I said, "Well, what would make you feel better?" And he said, "I want 10 minutes alone in a room with the pedophile that sodomized me for 6 years in the residential school that I went to. I just want 10 minutes alone with him now that I'm an adult man." And so the feeling across the country, for some people it was meaningful, for other people it was not. For every Indigenous person I spoke to, though, there are strong feelings about that. To non-Indigenous people that I speak to, they say, "Well, you know, that was a bad thing and it should never have happened, and I'm really sorry that it happened to your family." But it touches them in a different way, and it means something different because it's not happened to you or your family members. Finding a place to have people, Indigenous people, voice that in post-secondary educations is a really important thing, because it talks about how long we both have to go to reconcile that part of our history together. There's a guy named Adam Gowdry and a fellow named Lorenz who work at the University of Alberta, and they wrote an article. This is also for your light reading this summer. It's about Indigenization as inclusion, reconciliation, and decolonization. And they're talking about navigating different visions for indigenizing the Canadian Academy. What that indigenization looks like to me might look really different for you if you're not Indigenous, or you're a newcomer to this country, or you're teaching people that are newcomers. But they really see indigenization as a continuum or a spectrum. And they first talk about indigenization as Indigenous inclusion. And what they're really talking about there is Indigenous people that are hired into faculty positions, more Indigenous students recruited, but the structure of our institutions basically stays the same. And so it's kind of add Indigenous people and stir, but everything still comes out the same at the end. I'm paraphrasing. If you read their article, they might say something different. So this, the next one, or Indigenous inclusion, this is just basically what I was paraphrasing. Moving along the continuum, they say reconciliation, indigenization is something a little bit different. And it looks for common ground between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And it creates sort of a broader consensus about what Indigenization really is, and what it can mean, and how that looks different from Indigenous knowledge perspectives and from ours. I'd probably just leave it there. Decolonization, indigenization, that's where we're going to change everything. And we're going to make this stronger because our Indigenous knowledges, our ways of being, our ways of thinking are just interwoven into all the curriculum, into all the institutions. It means something different if the president of the university is Indigenous or whether he's non-Indigenous. It means something different if it's an Indigenous person standing at the front of the classroom doing the teaching versus a non-Indigenous person. So it looks for ways that we can co-teach together so that we can build something different than what currently exists. Is that clear for people? But you'll know by reading it this summer, right? Because the reference is there. And I know that you will. It's talking about transforming our academy into something that's different, that maybe we don't have a really clear picture of right now, but some people have good ideas. Who knows Michelle Pidgeon from Simon Fraser University or any of her writing? Oh, I'm going to be happy to tell her, like 8 people. I know that. She's written an article, and again, I think this is really key and critical if you're going to be teaching about indigenization, to take a look at what she's had to say. She said it's more than a checklist. Yeah, we've hired Indigenous faculty. Yeah, we've recruited, but we're not really talking about how many Indigenous students we've retained or how many have voted with their feet because this is not working for them. That's the link to her article, and she says, we've been at this indigenization process since the 1970s, but still our academic outcomes for Indigenous people are the lowest in the country of any specific segment. So there's obviously more that needs to be done. Shawneen Pete, who's heard about Shawneen Pete? Anybody? These are big people, big writers in our Indigenous communities. How many people routinely go to Indigenous journals to see what we're writing and talking about? If you're going to be teaching people about indigenization, you're going to be teaching about Indigenous concepts, I really encourage you to spend a little bit of time looking at those journals, seeing what's important to us, why we write about the things that we do. It will help you. You will become a stronger teacher, I think, if you become aware of it. Shawneen Pete worked as the Indigenization lead at the University of Regina for about 5 years, and she wrote an article specifically to Dean's Council people, deans, and faculty members about Indigenization. She calls it 100 Ways to Indigenize and Decolonize Academic Programs. This is a really key seminal document, and again, for your reading pleasure, sometime this summer. I'm just going to bring up a couple of things. by the end of this, I can do it without Moses. Won't that be nice? There we go. Shawneen was a huge presence at the University of Regina that has huge number of Indigenous students and faculty working there. The frustration that she came across, because she said, you know, she worked with a group of knowledge holders and knowledge keepers and elders and Indigenous peoples in developing the work that she did at the University of Regina. And at the end, she got so frustrated because of the inertia, because of the lack of the other 98% of faculty at universities and colleges that are non-Indigenous in this country. Indigenous people are only less than 2% of faculty. So moving this work along, I think, has been a disproportionate responsibility on our shoulders. And what I'm hopeful about is, because those people attended the workshop yesterday, there are going to be more allies that are interested in moving this forward. Shawneen got so frustrated that the last time I talked to her, she lives in Kelowna now, and her partner bought a pizza making company, and that's where she works with her PhD. We lost a tremendous person and leader in her when she left the institution. Now, together, Shawneen and Michelle says, you know, there's been some focus on Indigenization since the 70s by institutions, government, and Indigenous nations to improve Aboriginal people's participation and success in Canadian higher education. But we're failing. And I was reminded about what this looks like when I did my own doctoral program. There were 15 of us in it, 2 non-Indigenous people. In my program, all of my instructors were Indigenous. All of the readings that we had were Indigenous. Ceremony was a big part of that, and we really came together like brothers and sisters. Because of that focus so much on Indigenous issues and Indigenous writers and authors, there were 2 non-Indigenous people in my cohort. One was married to an Indigenous person and had Indigenous children, and so was admitted. And the second person had worked in Indigenous organizations for more than 25 years. They were the first 2 people to drop out of our program and not complete their PhD. That said a lot to me. That said a lot to my colleagues about what happens when everything is taught from one perspective, and how difficult that is for learners that don't share that perspective. But that's what we're asking Indigenous students to do in higher education, to leave their indigeneity at the door or at the edge of campus and just to become another mainstream person. For you that are teaching people from all over the world, newcomers to this country, I want you to give some thought to what we're asking them to do in the classroom about leaving their ancestral background, their indigeneity at the door. Because it means different things for different people. How am I doing for time? I don't have a watch up here. It could be noon. Oh, 5 minutes. Oh, excellent. Okay. That Karen, boy, she's just right on everything. I'm just going to take you down to these 100 ways to indigenize and decolonize. I'm just going to, if it will move, I'm just going to take you to some things that she has to say about teaching other people and Indigenous perspectives on that. She says, folks often think that indigenizing their teaching will somehow detract from addressing the needs of other diverse learners. Too often, dominant group members want to fall back onto discourse about multiculturalism as a way of practicing curricular inclusion. Verna St. Denis, she says that discourses of multiculturalism actually undermine our Indigenous sovereignty. She asserts that some Indigenous people believe that multiculturalism serves as a form of ongoing colonization. There's a lot of reasons that people have given and shared with me about why it's difficult for them to indigenize their curriculum or to work to decolonize their curriculum. And I've heard this many, many times. So I thought it was important that you hear what Verna has to say in response. If you're teaching people as newcomers, recognize that new Canadians and visiting students quickly adopt the dominant views about Indigenous people. And your role really is to help deconstruct with learners about the implications of ongoing alignment with dominance. And there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of ways to co-teach with Indigenous people, to bring Indigenous speakers in. She has 100 things that you can do and that your deans can do to help move that along. Anybody, again, how many people had ever heard of Shawneen Pete before I spoke to you about her? 1, 2, 3, 5 people. You know, what that tells me is that we have a long way to go, even with people that are concerned and interested and want to be allies. And it's finding those resources, finding the people, finding the connections, building those relationships, meaningful relationships that are more than a token. You know, you bring the elders into your class, they do an opening, and then they leave. You have one article written by an Indigenous person. I'm going to tell you too, lots of articles look like they might have been written by an Indigenous person, but if the person does not identify who they are, who their ancestors are, what nation they're from, they're likely not an Indigenous person. And so to be a little bit circumspect when it comes time to reviewing articles for inclusion. Oh. Look at that, Moses, hey? Wow. The nation I come from is Soto Nation. Well, the French called us Soto. The English called us Ojibwe. Our name for ourselves is Anishinaabe. For the Indigenous people that you're going to meet, I'm going to be Soto first. I'm going to be Canadian second, always. That's not the story that's told on my passport. It says I'm a Canadian citizen. I come from a sovereign nation. All of us Indigenous people do. We come from a place that is important, territory and land that is important. The Musqueam people, on whose unceded territory this institution sits, those people have a wait list of 360 people on their education wait list right now today. I heard your VP say, well, you know, Musqueam has gifted us with a pole. We have Musqueam elders that come in and speak. We have, you know, Indigenous supports, and those are all really good things. And I will know that this institution is moving towards decolonization and indigenization when Langara College says, all other things being equal, if you're a person from Musqueam, we have a 4-year tuition waiver for you here at this institution as our movement towards decolonization. And it's not just to pick on Langara. You're just the people here. You guys all come from institutions, and I hope when you go back, you start talking about what real reconciliation and indigenization looks like. Because we have a whole bunch of Indigenous people that are interested in post-secondary and a lack of resources because of a 2% federal funding cap, or because the reality is that we can't afford to put more than 2 or 3 people through an academic program every year. It's a stereotype that education is free for us. I wish that was the case, but that's not what's happened in our treaty relationship. So when you go back, I hope you find your president or your VP and you say, hey, what are we doing for the Nuu-chah-nulth people on whose territory this institution sits? What are we doing for the Secwepemc people? What are we doing for the Gitxsan people in the north? What about the Carrier people where the University of Northern British Columbia is? What are we doing around tuition waivers and support once they get into our institutions? Then I know we're all working together and we're paddling in the same direction. Miigwech, thank you for your time. Oh, you go.